Hey BookTube, it's Sarah and welcome back to my channel, The Book Bag. Today I am going to be rereading Brain on Fire by Susannah Cahalan. I read this book several years ago, I don't know, 3 to 4 years ago I think. It's a memoir by Susannah Cahalan, who is a journalist with a major New York newspaper, and it follows a time in her life when she was severely ill. She ended up having an autoimmune disorder, but it manifested itself as like psychosis and mania, and she ended up in a psych ward. And a lot of the stuff she doesn't actually remember, so it's a lot of it is pieced together through like footage and like stories from her friends and family. I remember really enjoying the writing in this. She is a journalist, so like she knows how to write. And it's really interesting seeing her like piece together what had happened to her from like not only her own recollections, but what her friends and family told her. From what I remember, it was pretty like fast-paced because there was a lot of like really bonkers stuff going on with her. She was like became super violent and was very like unstable mentally. I mean, the like subheading of it is My Month of Madness. But yeah, I haven't read this in a while and I just really remember enjoying it. I think this was one of the first nonfiction books that I really enjoyed. Certainly one of the first memoirs that really grabbed onto me and left a lasting impression. So I'm really excited to read this again and hopefully I'll like it as much as I did the first time. So I'll catch you when I have finished reading this and let you know whether or not it's still good or if past me was a fool. Hello.
Hello. What you reading?
Brain on Fire.
Very nice.
It's fitting because my brain feels like it's on fire because it's so hot. Okay, so I'm back. I have finished rereading Brain on Fire by Susannah Cahalan, and it was really good again. I definitely think I would reread it another time later in my life because it's a very quick read. It's only like, it's not even 300 pages, so it's like a super short read. I had forgotten that she was like a tabloid writer. I thought she worked for like, I don't know, a super like fancy prestigious newspaper, but she did work for, I think, the New York Post, which is a tabloid, which doesn't really like change anything, but kind of, I was like, oh my gosh, a tabloid writer, scandal. Basically being paparazzi, and I was like, girl. But yeah, you can tell she's a journalist in the writing in this. It feels very well researched without being like academic, and all of the like medical terminology and diagnoses and everything is obviously like coming from like a lay person's point of view, and so she explains them really well without making it like inaccessible to people like me who don't know anything about medicine. And because obviously she's not like a medical doctor, she's just someone who had medical issues. I think this book really, what is that guy carrying? He stole someone's catalytic converter.
He did.
Bruh. Do we? I think we have, do we have to call the police? Okay, so we just saw a guy riding down the path on a bike holding what seems to be a catalytic converter. So I think we have to go call the police in a little bit. But anyways, back to the book. I think she did a really good job of talking about how difficult it is for doctors to determine whether or not symptoms are due to like a mental illness or due to like a physical illness, because in her case she ended up having a super rare.
He ditched it somewhere. He's going by again.
Okay. All right, so we decided to play detective, and we left our apartment and went down across the street because we saw the guy come back like less than 10 minutes later without the catalytic converter or whatever he had. And so we're like, it's been like 3 minutes. Where could you possibly have put this? And there's like a big park right across the street from us with like some buildings and stuff. So we went across the road to kind of like be like, maybe he stashed it here. And we found it. And we called the cops. So who knows? Maybe they'll show up. Hopefully the person will get their part back. Yeah, so that was exciting. definitely could never be in law enforcement, aside from all the issues with law enforcement, because that much crime stopping was, my heart's racing, I'm sweating. That was too much for me. We're gonna get back to books. My happy place. Okay, what was I saying? So I think what this book does really well is talk about the link between kind of your mental health and your physical health, and how it can be hard to determine the source of a lot of symptoms, because, spoiler alert, she ends up having a really rare autoimmune disorder, but her symptoms present almost entirely as like mental illness symptoms. A lot of doctors diagnosed her with like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, because she was acting like she had bouts of psychosis, and they thought that it was like a mental disorder rather than like a physical illness that they could treat. She did a really good job of like kind of delving into different like mental illnesses, as well as the history of like the illness she ended up having. And it was quite fascinating, but also a little bit upsetting, because then you really realize how much we don't know about our bodies and about our minds, and how easy it can be to have various diseases that have very similar symptoms and yet need incredibly different treatments. So just like freaks you out a little bit, but it's okay. I also totally forgot that she had like a boyfriend in this who stuck with her through the whole thing. They'd only been dating like a few months, and they weren't even like living together or anything when she had this episode. And I was like, wow, that is quite the commitment. So that was pretty interesting too. I also really liked how throughout the book she sometimes had like little pictures, like these are some drawings from the first bits of her illness where she was experiencing bouts of like psychosis and stuff, and was, you know, off her rocker a little bit. They show the deterioration of her mental state. There's also like later in her stay in the hospital, one of the doctors had her do this clock drawing, which is like a pretty textbook test on like whether or not the hemispheres of your brain are like communicating properly, and in this case they were not, and she had basically the like right hemisphere of her brain was not connecting properly, and there was some issue there because she had like complete like neglect of like the left field of vision, and the brain's cross-wired. I also totally forgot that she had written this book a few years after she had experienced this month of madness, as she calls it. But she ended up being like a pretty important case study in her disease. Plus, she had written a newspaper article about her disease, like in the tabloid paper where she works. And that brought a lot of awareness to the disease, which then like allowed for other people to be diagnosed with it, which was obviously very important because it can be a pretty fatal disease. I do think that the first read of this was a little bit more impactful, just because it is a kind of like sensational, shocking story. And so going into it, I did remember some like the more shocking parts, obviously, because they were pretty memorable. Like her delusions about the bed bugs that really like set off her like episodes of psychosis. So that was like not worse, but like I knew some of that stuff already, so it wasn't as shocking as the first time. And so that part of the book really flew by the second time reading it, whereas I remember it being a much bigger chunk of the book from my first go through of the book. But it was still really good, and it was still really interesting, and I still got a whole bunch of like different facts. But yeah, rereading it was still really interesting, and I learned more and got to remember some things that I had totally forgotten about this book. So I think if I had to rate it on Goodreads again, probably like 5 stars again, I think. It's still a really good memoir. I don't think it's my favorite memoir anymore. I think Know My Name by Chanel Miller gets top spot, but this is definitely one of the top memoirs and like one of my top books too. So thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know if you've read this book or what your favorite memoir is. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Whether or not you're the left hemisphere of her brain, I can't remember what it's called, but like basically the left hemisphere of her brain was like not, no, that's wrong, because it's on the right side.